Hi, this is Mr. Fike, and this is my brief talk on the paradox of collective rationality, which includes the assumptions that we are making, which is A, that we are exclusively egoistically motivated, and second, that we are capable of rationality. So I'm going to rely almost exclusively on PowerPoint and just talk us through this. So let's see if this works. Okay. Why, first of all, are we concerned with this? Well, it demonstrates a potential obstacle to keeping contracts. To tell the truth is one example of a contract, right? So we're not just referring to like buying a house or agreement to pay a credit card on a certain date every month or things like that, but more fundamental, ethically relevant contracts that we either tacitly, in other words, we just assume that we have them, or that we explicitly make. So telling the truth, marital vows, the commitments that are involved in friendship, civil laws, right? And civil principles, just principles of behavior, are kind of tacit contracts that we all sort of have willy-nilly, which means whether we like it or not, right? We don't really choose them, but they just sort of inform how it is that we live our lives in conjunction with other people. And then, of course, criminal laws, right? How do we keep those contracts? Well, so we're concerned because such contracts exist, but also this is going to illustrate a common philosophical tactic. And that is that by taking an extreme example, we can see the imaginable outcomes of an idea when pushed to its extremes. And furthermore, it addresses the worst case scenario, which is kind of nice, right? So what if it were true that in every case, people acted only out of self-interest? And then finally, by examining the worst case scenario, if our ethical, social, or political policies were established in light of this worst case, right? Everybody's always acting out of self-interest. They will have addressed lesser instances in which self-interest clearly does play a dominant role, if not an exclusive role. So in other words, by going to the extremes and just assuming, all right, let's just assume that everybody is selfish all the time. Well, then what would the outcome of this be in terms of our ability to come to agreements and, frankly, psychologically, our ability to rest relatively reassured that the agreements that we either tacitly or explicitly take on will actually be adhered to? So let's imagine Sky and Natalie. So Sky has ATW, which stands for all the water. And then Natalie has all the food, ATF. Okay, that's a setup. Now, Sky, a human being, has all the water. Natalie, a human being, has all the food. All human beings need both water and food. So Sky needs some of what Natalie has, and Natalie needs some of what Sky has. Now, here are assumptions made explicit. First of all, A1, Natalie and Sky are both exclusively egoistically motivated. And secondly, Natalie and Sky are both capable of rationality. In other words, they may not always be rational, but when the stakes are high, the rationality kicks in and they do a calculation. So because of A2, sorry about that, I guess my gal has some device on that's picking up my voice and trying to help me. Okay, so let's try again. Natalie and Sky are both exclusively egoistically motivated. They're both capable of rationality. Now, because of the fact that they're both capable of rationality, Natalie reasons that Sky wants Natalie's food without giving up any of his water, and that's because Sky is exclusively egoistically motivated, but likewise, Sky reasons that Natalie wants Sky's water without giving up any of her food. Hope I got those labels right. I think I did. Furthermore, they both know that the other will reason just as they have. They recognize they're both human beings. If I've got these two capacities, then the other party to this has those capacities as well. Finally, on a thoroughgoing Hobbesian view, so here I assume that you've already read about Thomas Hobbes, since desire is endless, that's just our nature as human beings. We just want. Both ideally would like to take all of what the other has. Okay, so that's an idealization, but in philosophy, we try to go to that extreme to see what the results would be. So what happens if they try to establish a contract? And again, or maybe not again, but it needs to be said that the point of the contract is to produce an environment in which cooperation actually occurs. I mean, when you think about it, ethics is about cooperation. Now, getting people to cooperate is problematic because people have disagreements, obviously, in their behavior and also in their beliefs. So what happens? Sky, his number one choice would be to violate the contract while Natalie keeps it. Why? Because then he'd get all the food and all the water. He'd have both. Because Natalie would keep the end of her end of the deal and Sky would violate it. Now that's an idea, that too is an idealization when I say all. Next in order, Sky will prefer that each of them keep the contract. I mean, that's why they're doing this in the first place, so that each gains a benefit, the commodity that the other person has all of, that they need at least some of. And then notice I skipped here. I went 1, 2, and now to 4. What Sky would really dislike is if he keeps his end of the bargain, but Natalie breaks her end of the contract. That would be awful, right? Now, Sky realizes that Natalie has his nature, so she'll reason through this just as he is, which is tantamount to never being able to reach an agreement. The contract is rendered null and void since neither party to it can keep it, right? So they're each constrained by the other's recognition that the other thinks just like they do. And so why can neither party keep the terms of the contract? Neither party keeps the contract because they reason identically. So I actually spoke ahead. Natalie will most want to violate the contract while Sky keeps it. Natalie will next prefer that each of them keep the contract. What Natalie would really like is if he keeps his end, that is Sky, but Sky breaks his end of, what Natalie would really dislike is if she keeps her end. So that's an error. I'll have to fix that. But Sky breaks his end of the contract. And then finally, Natalie realizes that Sky has her nature. So he reasons through this just as she did. See the previous slide, which is tantamount to never being able to reach an agreement. The contract is rendered null and void since neither party to it can keep it. So the slides are really just, the previous slide and this slide are identical, except that Natalie and Sky are reversed. And so I want to just point out once again that 4 should say, what Natalie would really dislike is if she keeps her end, but Sky breaks his end of the contract. She'd hate that, right? But excuse me, why can neither party keep it? In other words, if you're following this, it may still not be quite clear. So the outcome, part one, the paradoxical outcome works like this. If Natalie keeps it, Sky will break it. Why? Why will Sky break it? Because that means he gets his most preferred outcome, which is choice one, while Natalie gets her least preferred outcome, choice four. But she would never allow that to happen, given that she's capable of rationality and she wants as much as she can get. On the other hand, if Sky keeps it, Natalie will break it. That means that Natalie gets her most preferred outcome, while Sky gets his least preferred outcome. He would never allow that to happen, given that he's capable of rationality and the stakes are high in this case, right? So for either of them to keep the contract, they would have to break one of the two assumed features of their nature. They would either be motivated by irrationality, or they would be moved by a principle less than absolute self-interest. So they both get their third choice. However, in the last slide, we saw that what collective rationality produces, far less than we might suppose. In fact, it produces nothing, no cooperation. Neither one is going to actually cooperate for fear that the other person would then get their number one outcome. Paradoxically, here's why it's called a paradox. Each already ranked cooperation as their second choice. Natalie keeps the terms of the contract. Sky keeps the terms of the contract. They even realize by A2 that the other sees this as well. So they say to themselves, well, the other party here is capable of rationality as well. And so they know that what I'm thinking, we're thinking the same thing, right? And it's kind of like that thing where, you both sign a contract, but then you don't want to give it to the other one until you get theirs at the same exact moment, right? It's a real stalemate. So individually, they know it's better to cooperate, but collectively, they see that the restraints on their nature are such that cooperation is impossible. So that's the paradox. I know it's rational as an individual to cooperate. I know it's rational as an individual to cooperate. However, when I think of you cooperating and me cooperating, I know that neither of us will, because then the other one will exploit that cooperation and move to their number one choice. That's the paradox. Okay. All right. So the rescue from without. So we've seen that assuming the worst about human nature, the least desirable in terms of actually being conducive to terms in which people would cooperate, it makes us unable to cooperate if we assume the worst. So we've used an extreme example to show this. However, we've also proceeded as though Natalie and Sky are the sole interested parties. Given their dilemma, it would at least be nice if we could find an outside source that would help them to get to two, which again, reminding you, is I keep and you keep, since three is worthless and striving for one, their most preferred outcome, always lands each person with four. So what kinds of outside forces are available to them in this idealized picture? Well, one is a sovereign, and this was Hobbes' conclusion. So the idea here is that they are not going to be able to enforce this contract by themselves. That argues for the idea of having an entity, a power outside of them who is not subject to the terms of the contract and who is in fact absolute in his or her judgments. At that time, of course, it's likely to have been a him. Now we had Queen Elizabeth, so things changed, but even she was not an absolute sovereign. So we're going back, as you all know, about 500 years. And so back then, sovereigns were absolute. So the idea is the sovereign could levy great penalties against them for breaking their contract, right? So their self-interest was modified rationally by the recognition that if they don't honor the contract, they'd wind up in prison, or maybe, and this is not far-fetched, wind up with their hand cut off or something horrible, right? This was a time of, potential tortuous consequences if you didn't keep your contract, including death, which, as we know, is the worst possible evil for Thomas Hobbes. Well, another possibility is the force of morality itself. And so later in our course, we'll be addressing that when we look a little bit more carefully at natural law theory. And this is the idea that there's something about nature itself that imposes penalties upon us if we don't, in certain instances, cooperate. And so that then becomes a compelling basis upon which it becomes modified, in a modified manner, reasonable for us to act in cooperative fashions, even though we're still exclusively egoistically motivated. So that's at least a possibility. Third is God, right? So yes, we're all, take one example of this approach. We're all born with a sinful nature, and that's why God has to impose a law from without. And therefore, God is, somehow in control of what morality dictates. And then fourthly, agreed upon principles. And this is really social contract theory without, you might say, the self-interested, exclusive self-interested characteristic of human nature, right? So we have that problem still to deal with. And you've read a bit about that in this unit. But if we could manage agreed upon rational principles, perhaps via Rawls, you remember his particular theory that involved the veil of ignorance, for example, in which we deliberate about principles of justice. However, the problem there, and the problem likewise with Smith and Gautier, you recall that Gautier has a volume called Morals by Agreement, is that they don't assume that we are exclusively exclusively egoistically motivated. And so that's a problem there. Let's see now. So the general question here is, how do each of these fare, given two things, really? One is that each has its own challenges. And then secondly, that except for four, we're still assuming psychological egoism. So the question here really is, do we have to abandon psychological egoism to actually have a workable social contract theory? And if you're still inclined to think, I better take into consideration at least the possibility that rational egoism, that universal self-interest is actually true, or that exclusive egoistic motivation is actually true, maybe I need to look for another basis for morality. And so in our course later, we'll actually look at 2 and 3, right? Natural law, and also the idea that God is going to be the source of morality. But what we're going to find as well is that in all of these cases, there are, of course, difficulties that confront those ideas as well, right? And so we'll be exploring that in the second half of the course. All right, so I think there I'll stop this video. And again, I do recommend that you play this back in time and a half speed. Of course, I'm tacking that on to the end. But also you can drag your cursor around if you want to see some of these particular slides. And then finally, I'll try to remember to put this under files within our course. Okay, very good. I think that that will conclude this presentation on the paradox of collective rationality, given the assumptions that we are exclusively egoistically motivated and are capable of rationality. I hope some of this helps, obviously. That's the whole point.